We've all been transported to worlds beyond our wildest imagination with books. But books are also a great vehicle to get together and exchange ideas. Welcome to Books du Jour. Come and join our authors at the table. Welcome back for a new episode of Books du Jour. We are in New York City, it's a snowy day, but we have a very warm table of authors, which I'm going to introduce to you. And I will start with someone from England. Her name is Jane Green, Saving Grace. Then we go to something which is actually not dreadful, and I put it this way so you can read it. It's The Short Life and Gay Times of John Burns by David Margolick. And interesting title, yeah, we have to know about it.
A risky title.
A risky title for a publisher, yes. And you've been publicly shamed, there's nothing else to say about him. John Ronson, I'm sure you heard all about his previous book, about the extremist and the man who stared at goats and Lost at Sea. Uh-huh. And he's probably lost in New York now, yeah?
Yeah.
But Jane, it was a very interesting description of a story, you know, because when I read American novels, and you're from Britain, and I felt like, oh, maybe she's been here too long, because you start about the perfect family, the perfect farmhouse in the Hudson Valley, and then there's a threat of the other coming into the house. Mm. Do you think it's an American topic? There's a bit of a paranoia that someone is, when you have your life together, someone is going to come and destroy it?
I don't know that it's uniquely American. I do think that the concept of the American dream and having this wonderful life and this wonderful house is something that I've adopted since I've been here, and I've definitely sort of softened and romanticized my view. And of course, as a novelist, I'm fascinated by the flaws. A growing theme over the years has been this concept of just things not being what they appear. And particularly, we were talking earlier, I live out in the suburbs in Westport, Connecticut, where everything appears to be perfect. People live in wonderful houses, and you don't have to scratch very hard to discover all kinds of deep, dark things that I actually find always quite surprising. On the one hand, it provides excellent material. On the other hand, there are only so many books you can drag out of it, and I've written 17 novels, and I'm sort of thinking I'm a little bit done with this other.
So it's great because you feel the character just built on the strong will and the mother and everything. She is a bit insecure. She doesn't have that weight of herself, so she believes what she's being told, and she relies on the external world.
Who isn't insecure? And then this is Grace, who is the protagonist of Saving Grace, who is married to a bestselling author and appears to have this perfect life, and then it all starts to go wrong. And of course, she's told, well, you have a mental illness and you need to be taking drugs. And it focuses on bipolar disorder. And the extraordinary thing is, in 1996, before the advent of Prozac, 1 in 20,000 people were diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and today it's 1 in 20. And you just think, how is that possible?
Not just bipolar disorder.
It's a lot of
ADHD.
Do you think there's a birth for we talk about Foucault, the birth of the clinics and the birth of psychiatry? Like we are creating these fields where we can use as a market.
Yeah, well, I wrote a lot about this in a book I wrote called The Psychopath Test, which is in part about the rise of the DSM, so the rise, not just the rise of the pharmaceutical companies, but also the rise of diagnosis and labelling. And, DSM used to be like a pamphlet. In the 50s, it was like a pamphlet. It was like no mental disorders. And then it grew and grew, and the last edition of the DSM was 886 pages long. Yeah. When DSM-3 came out, which was the first big DSM, which was this kind of brick of a book, it was really exciting, that you could diagnose yourself with mental disorders, and way more copies of the DSM sold than there were psychiatrists in America. Yeah. It was a huge bestseller.
But everybody was looking for themselves.
Yeah, and I was thrilled, to find out, that I had, 12 mental disorders.
That's it?
But then
that's not a cocktail.
Right.
Yeah.
There used to be childhood bipolar disorder, but then they were getting all these 4-year-old kids onto onto antipsychotic medication, and then kids were dying, so they had to get rid of childhood bipolar disorder. So they changed it to disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, and that's the new potential epidemic.
And I just was in school, you know, one of my kids is struggling with homework. You know, but of course everyone's struggling with homework because everyone's attached to technological devices and no one has any attention span anymore.
Right.
And the school psychologist said, you know, in the new DSM-5, they fit the criteria of this attention deficit disorder, and I really think they should be on medication. I just said no. And no, I don't believe you. I don't believe in the DSM-5. I think the DSM-5 is a terrible book.
Is there any evidence that all of these diagnoses and all of this medication is actually helping society at large?
I think sometimes it helps. I mean, I would always cite something like obsessive compulsive disorder as it only being positive if somebody gets that diagnosis, because otherwise you just don't know what the hell's going on. You know, your mind's all over the place, and then you can focus your mind if you get a diagnosis of OCD. So it can help. I mean, I don't want to be too Ardy-Lang.
Well, no, but there's also something like bipolar is a very real mental illness that can be transformed by these medications. The problem is, as you said, it's with the diagnoses. It's that people are being slapped with these labels who just don't.
I want to come back here. I want to come back to you. David, there are still people who believe that homosexuality is an illness.
Right.
And you know, we have this huge transformation over the last 2 years. How would you think like John will feel these days? If
I
he
think
had been
that
in
John
alive?
Horne Burns, the man that I wrote about, would be staggered by the acceptance of gays in this culture. I mean, he would find this world completely unrecognizable. He grew up he was born in 1916. He came of age during World War II. He wrote a novel that sort of described the life of a gay soldier during World War II. I mean, these were secretive and beleaguered people. And the idea that everybody would be talking about it and it would be so routinely discussed, you know, among us and among people on the street and in the press and all of that, I think he would find utterly unimaginable.
So why pick up and write the book about John Byrne?
Well, I came to it in kind of an unusual way. I went to this boarding school in Connecticut in the 60s, and somebody pulled me aside and said, and whispered to me that there had been a scandalous novel written about this school many years earlier, and the book was still banned from the school library. And that was the first I ever heard of John Horne Burns. The book was called Lucifer with a Book. It wasn't his most important book, but it got me interested in him in the 60s, and it took me 50 years to write the book, but I was always curious about the guy.
It's incubation time. Some
The
people
incubation time was extremely long, but I learned that he was a very important novelist after the war, that he wrote one of the most important novels about World War II, and one of the first novels in which he described the experience of a gay soldier. It was one of those happy accidents of a book that nonfiction people may experience more than fiction. I guess you go in the direction that you discover, and all kinds of things unfold. In this case, I had no idea about who this man was, and I discovered this whole amazing life that he had led over the course of 36 or 37 years until he killed himself, essentially.
There's been a lot of gay writer, I mean, a poet as well in the American tradition, but this one is in the army. Is that the only reason why you feel like he's relevant to today's world?
No, I think that his experience as a gay man in that era is unique. You can't say pretty unique, it's unique. No one was writing about it. Certainly no one was writing letters home about being gay and what it was like to be a gay soldier during the war. This is not the kind of thing that you wrote to mom and dad. But it just so happened that he had a gay student at this prep school at Loomis where I had gone. And so he had this extremely candid correspondence with a fellow gay man about what it was like to be a gay soldier. And I think there's nothing else in the literature that rivals these letters, which were saved entirely by coincidence from the dumpster.
I was very intrigued about the book because it took you 50 years to incubate it. The writing process was, what, a couple of years?
I was a reporter on the New York Times for many years, and there's a wonderful morgue there where all the old clippings are collected, and I pulled the file on him probably 25 years ago. There was a long article by Gore Vidal about him because he was a great rival, and he was a contemporary and rival of Gore Vidal's. And so I pulled the clippings on him, but I didn't write about him right away. And originally I thought it was going to be just a magazine story. But as I say, it was one of these happy accidents of a book that actually grew into a book.
So you wrote the book and then you sold it? Is that how it
Yes,
worked
I
with
brought
Judith?
it to Judith Gurevich of Other Press, and without reading a word of it, she bought it.
Oh, wow.
Much to her credit.
So, John, how many times have you been publicly shamed yourself?
Have I been publicly shamed? No.
Well, we can get started right here. Everything you say has been recorded, and we will double check all the facts.
I shamed some people one time.
Okay.
Some academics created a fake John Ronson and put it on Twitter.
Yeah, I read that.
Yeah, and then
3 lads from Britain.
Yeah, these 3 academics. It suddenly appeared. I just noticed one day that there was another John Ronson on Twitter, tweeting about it's dinner parties. Like I can't wait to have
And genital.
Yeah, and dinner parties and genitals. And
Do they have more followers than you?
no, but I did notice that it was being followed by people who knew me in real life. And I was suddenly wondering why I'd suddenly become so interested in fusion cooking and dinner parties. I mean, this is like the only dinner parties I will ever go to are fake ones for the television like this. I mean, I would never go to a dinner party in real life. And because of what you said, I'm so introverted. And suddenly here was this fake John Ronson on Twitter who was like the opposite of me, extroverted and garrulous and constantly going on about wasabi dumplings. And I felt this kind of tightness in my chest. So
Well, he was supplementing you in a way, complimenting you.
Well, he was having a better,
actually work.
He was having a better life than I was having.
But you have to read the
About
book
that.
because you feel like you've fallen into a Philip Dick novel. You're not quite sure if it's real or it's true.
It's real.
And
That's like all of John's books, so they're all like that. You can't quite believe
But
them.
it was really the first chapter you're talking about.
Yeah.
And I was like, he says, no, he's kidding. It's not possible.
No, it's all real.
They managed to make you doubt about yourself.
Well, yes, absolutely.
That's the point.
But then what happened was, so they wouldn't take down their spam
right,
bots.
yeah.
They refused. And so finally, I said to them, because I thought I was going to have a stroke. So finally I said to them, look, if you won't take down your spam bot, can I film you and put it on YouTube? So I filmed them. And then I read the YouTube comments underneath, and they were just being torn. Everyone was on my side. And at first I was kind of thrilled, and I felt like Braveheart, like striding through a field with thousands behind me. And then everyone was like going, gas them, and I was thinking, whoa. And suddenly I thought, I'm getting a huge amount of pleasure from these people's destruction. And that's not like me. So I think that's why I decided to write this book. We were talking before about the DSM and diagnoses and about how certain institutions like to reduce other people to...
So what's your code for your darkness?
What's that?
What's the code for your darkness?
Oh, you mean have I got like a mental disorder? Oh, well, yeah, of course.
We'll come back to that later.
Schadenfreude disorder. But in the psychopath test, I talked about how, psychiatry and the pharmaceutical industry has got this kind of propensity to turn people into, reduce people into these one-dimensional, labels. And then I suddenly thought, wow, on Twitter, we're doing it. We're turning people into monsters if somebody writes a tweet that turns out badly. So that's why I wanted to write So You've Been Publicly Shamed, because I suddenly thought, wow, we've become the crazy people now.
Now, do you think we're turning our society into sort of a big brother when everyone is watching everyone?
I think it's equitable to the Stasi.
And the Stasi.
The Stasi, the
yeah.
East German secret police. When you would ask Stasi officers why they managed to get so many willing informants, how did you persuade them? The answer was, they just said yes. And then it's like, well, why? And it was, it's an impulse to make sure that your neighbour is doing the right thing. It was good-hearted intentions in East Germany that led to people being destroyed. And the same thing's happening on social media now. It's our good-hearted intentions that are leading us
And
to...
are people's lives being... obviously, it's not for the same pernicious purposes.
It's for on both occasions it was about creating utopias. It's about people doing the right thing and being good people.
Or publicly shaming. I mean, I think Twitter is rife with that. And I remember a few years ago being sort of goaded into this, what would have been a Twitter war had I responded. And somebody had written some things about me, who had a number of followers, had written some things about me. and encourage their followers to weigh in. And it got very vicious very quickly. I couldn't quite believe it. And of course, because we're all able to hide, behind the anonymity of Twitter, but I'm very nervous of Twitter. I don't use it. You use it, and you use it very well. I don't really. I just throw out things every now and then, or I retweet, but I don't use it because I think there's too much that can go wrong.
Do you think that it's irresponsible or foolish or ostrich-like not to be part of the whole Twitter culture?
I think you have to be part of it.
You have to. I mean, a writer like me is foolish not to be a part of it, right?
Yeah, but that makes it sound like it's about marketing, and to I suppose to an extent it is. But actually, it can be a good thing. It can be a positive thing. But the problem, and politically, it can be good. I mean, the Black Lives Matter protests are formed on Twitter.
The Egyptian Rising, the Tunisian were all.
No, I understand about all that. I mean, creating political networks. It's a great force for activism. I just wonder how much the average individual, particularly somebody who's a writer, is really inhibiting himself or limiting his experiences or his exposure to contemporary culture not to be a part of that conversation.
I think you make a choice. My choice is Facebook. And I do that because my demographic, the women that I'm writing for, are not on Twitter. Middle-aged housewives are not on Twitter. They're on Facebook.
Yeah. You're talking to your readers on Facebook.
I'm talking to my readers. It lets me know what they think of my books.
Yeah.
It makes me feel connected. It's also a wonderful marketing tool. I can let them know. I can do competitions. I can do giveaways. I can do all kinds of things on Facebook.
But the thing I find most interesting is what all of this is doing to our personalities.
Sure. The fact you were enjoying the destruction aspect.
Yeah,
or discovering you had that in you. So the shaping of the psychology, of the psyche,
Yeah. My first book, Them, is about, political extremists and religious extremists and conspiracy theorists and so on. People over there. And the psychopath test is about people over there. But what I noticed with social media is that, it was changing our personalities and we were becoming extremists.
Do you think the world has changed tremendously on that front since 9/11? Sort of a retaliation against the other?
I've got a friend called Rachel North who was blown up on a train in London, and she survived and became a spokesperson. And because what she was saying didn't tally with what the conspiracy theorists wanted her to say, they stalked her they sent her threatening letters and were convinced she didn't exist.
I'm intrigued by the business about the Stasi, and you're saying that, in a way, the anonymity that all of these devices give to people have basically allowed everyone to become Stasi agents and report on people and create the same kinds of sort of terror that an oppressive communist political organization did in a country.
I think to a large extent that's true. I don't think it's just the anonymity, because a lot of people aren't anonymous on Twitter. There's a certain aspect to it's more like drone strikes. We're all
drones flying up, and we can just sort of
drop the bomb and not
by remote control.
Yeah, and not feel responsible. And I wondered, well, why? Why is this happening? Is it some kind of group madness? And the conclusion I came to in the end is no, it's the earnest desire to do good.
Right.
Is what's motivating this.
Under Stalin, there were confessions. People were forced to confess their crime. The Chinese did the same.
Yeah.
The big time, the Gang of Four, etc. And now, when we take someone like Anthony Weiner and Elliot Spitzer, they have to go live on TV and say, "I'm sorry, I did this." And is there still the need to be forgiven?
The Stasi would intercept people's private thoughts, like love letters to illicit boyfriends or girlfriends, like Western girlfriends. Whereas on Twitter, we put our own private thoughts up there ourselves in the mistaken belief that it's a safe place to talk about yourself to strangers. Then what happens, what happens once you've been publicly shamed?
When you are an introvert, you feel very safe on Twitter, but it's very easy to quickly start to view everything in life through the lens of Twitter, through the lens of what can I say about this situation that is funny or pithy or clever, that will gain the most reaction. And I think that that removes us from our lives in a way that is not good for us. We're not present anyway. When you look at lines of people now in restaurants, you look at them and nobody's aware of what's going on around them. Everybody's glued to a screen.
That's right.
And it was also another reason why I took a step back.
How do you work up the concentration to write a paragraph when you have all these distractions all the time?
You can get into a rhythm where you write really well for like an hour,
Right.
then you go on Twitter and you clear your head and you don't feel so overwhelmed.
Right.
And then when you don't feel overwhelmed, you go back to
It
writing.
fits right into ADD.
Yeah.
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 It's a good time to be ADD.
It's a wonderful time.
It's a wonderful time
the
to
thing
be
is that you
ADD.
can be forgiven for everything you do.
Can I also, there actually, my life-changing discovery was an app called Freedom. It takes you offline for us. It says, how many minutes of freedom do you want?
Right?
And you plug in 120, and for 2 hours, you cannot get online for love nor money.
Yeah, that sounds horrible.
Genius. It's genius. It's the only way, because if I didn't, I'm online all the time checking things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you feel like yourself, your monkey mind distracts you. Yeah.
That's exactly
You're going
right.
back
And
to
I have
19
the ability to if I remove those distractions, I have the ability to hyper-focus.
But that's what's interesting. You need something from the outside to do it for you because you can't do it yourself.
I can't.
That's
I can't do it
interesting.
myself.
I want to go back to John Horne Burns, talking about DSM in darkness. What killed him?
He'd written a great novel about World War II called The Gallery.
The Gallery, yes.
And he suddenly found himself catapulted into fame overnight.
And he was young.
And he was young. He was in his early 30s. You know, he was suddenly being heralded as the next Passos or Hemingway. He was the great voice of the American GI from World War II, and his future was limitless. But he'd always had this war going on within himself. He was essentially a very bitter and angry guy, and the war brought out a kind of humanity in him that allowed him to write a great book. But his bitchy side sort of resurrected itself after this great book came out, and then he wrote the prep school book. And in the way, I mean, you've written 16 novels. I don't know if you can remember your second novel, but the second novel, as you know, is historically the harder one to write. And everybody, if your first novel was praised, everybody is laying in wait for you to attack you. And his second novel was roundly criticized, and I think that he never got over that. He was a drinker anyway, and I think he started to fall into decline very, very quickly after that. And he never really adjusted, and he essentially drank himself to death.
Do you have a sense why?
I think that he probably worried that he had nothing else great to say,
But
or that as a gay man, he couldn't really write about the world that he knew. This was still a time where you couldn't really come right out and say that you were gay, even though what he was writing all but proclaimed it. You know, everybody wanted him to write about something that he really didn't know anything about, and he felt stymied and stifled, and he had nothing left to say, and he suddenly forgot how to write. The letters that he wrote during World War II, which are going to be published separately, are quite extraordinary. He could toss off wonderful things in an aerogram to his mother, and then only a few years later, sitting down and writing, he couldn't write anything like of that order or that quality. And so he basically just drove himself into the ground.
It's interesting too when people make those choices, whether conscious or unconscious, just to give up, and then death came shortly after.
Well, you know, there's that famous line of Gore Vidal's about, Gore Vidal said about Truman Capote that dying was a good career move. Burns had nothing left in him, and perhaps it was a good career move.
Did Gore Vidal have anybody that wasn't a rival?
No, and Gore Vidal didn't see anybody who wasn't a rival. I mean, these guys were incredibly competitive, and there's a scene in my book where Gore Vidal and John Horne Burns are at the same cocktail party, and looking at each other warily. I mean, they viewed themselves as very much rivals.
I met him shortly before he died, and he was really mean.
Well,
You
that's
met him
very,
once?
I can't get into his psyche, but I think it was probably just the province of a gay man in that era. He was an angry guy. All of these guys were never angrier than they were against other gay men. Vidal said, the one thing that I have that Burns doesn't have is that I'm going to last. He said he could see Burns destroying himself, and he said, I'm going to live forever, and he did. I mean, he lived for another 50 years. And so one of them you've heard of, and the other one you haven't.
Yeah. Jane, you yourself went through a tough period for a couple of years of being misdiagnosed, illnesses, darkness, you know, the medication you were given, the diagnosis. When you look back at it, you feel like that brought something about you that just changed you forever, or like either being cynical? Or...
It has fundamentally changed me, all of it. Cancer was always my big fear, actually, and I always, everything, you know, I find a spot, well, that's Kaposi's sarcoma, I know, and I spent my whole life dreading cancer, and of course, suddenly you hear, you know, your doctor's on the end of the phone saying, it's cancer.
It's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way, you know, you almost will it.
I would have expected myself to have completely fallen apart, and actually, instead, I found myself plunged into this, this state of acceptance. I mean, I was very clear, it is what I can't change this. You know, there's nothing I can do.
It must almost be a relief if you've been worried about having cancer all your life. It's almost a relief to get it.
Yeah.
You don't have to worry about it anymore.
You shouldn't have to go through that to find out.
Also, this is really true of anxious people in general, right? Is that the anxieties always manifest themselves in kind of irrational ways. And actually, when something bad does happen to somebody who suffers from anxiety, they usually handle it pretty well.
Yes, I handled
really
it.
interesting.
Yes.
We won't ask you how yours manifests itself. But I think it's a beautiful point to wrap up our episodes today. So my first goes to Jane Green for Selling Grace. It's a beautiful book. So last week you said it came out.
Last
yes?
week it came, yes.
We have Dreadful, which is not a dreadful book at all, The Short Life and Gay Times of John Horne. And can you do a Brit accent? Come on, go for it.
Yeah, it's called So You've Been Publicly Shamed.
So You've Been Publicly Shamed, you say, with a soft voice. John Ronson, thank you for being on Books du Jour, and it was lovely talking all of you.
Thanks.
And don't be afraid of me, but I'll be afraid of you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.